So here's the best shot from a 21-day challenge that I set myself, which was to get the best shot I could from a local landmark, Castle Rock, here in Christchurch on the Port Hills. So there are two main reasons I set myself this 21-day challenge. The first one is to give myself a deadline. So with client work, I always have a deadline, and it really helps focus the work and bring it to completion. And I always have personal projects running alongside client work because it keeps me motivated, keeps me fresh. However, with personal projects, I can tend to procrastinate and also fiddle with images until I think they're perfect, but of course they're never perfect. So what can tend to happen is nothing ever gets finished or published or used. So a deadline is really useful for personal projects particularly. I think it's better to complete a project and then move on to another one. I think that's a better way of learning, of making progress. The reason I've chosen 21 days to do the project is it gives me a long enough length of time to try a range of weather and lighting conditions and also work out what the best positions would be to take the photograph from. It gives me just enough time to experiment with those sort of things, but not too much time, so I end up fiddling around a lot. The second reason I've set myself a 21-day challenge is to try and gather together some competition-worthy images. I want to enter competitions, photographic competitions, over the next year or so. Having these 3-week projects gives me sequential deadlines for which I can produce material from. And so over time, over a few months, I should be able to produce a portfolio of competition-worthy images. So I chose Castle Rock in Christchurch's Port Hills because apart from being a beautiful location, I can get there in 30 minutes by electric bike, which means I can take advantage of sunrise, sunset, and varying weather conditions. So it's about 25 minutes before sunrise. A bit of a whiteout up here. So I'm not sure if I'll get any shots this morning. Always got to come up and have a look. So this particular image, which I think is my best shot from the 3 weeks, is not actually of Castle Rock. Let me explain. In about the end of the second week, as I was moving around different locations and views of Castle Rock, I noticed a really good view looking into the sunrise where I could easily put myself into the frame, and it was quite spectacular. It was of a rocky outcrop that wasn't actually on the map, but it's part of the Torres Reserve, which is where I was taking photographs from. And I think just the composition and the lighting, it just worked out to be the best shot. So it's good to be a bit flexible. I did get some really nice shots of Castle Rock, shots I'm really happy with, but I think this shot here is the best one from the lot. I'll quickly show you the processing of this image. It is a stitched image taken from a drone. The advantage of the drone, of course, being that I can position the camera virtually anywhere. So here we are in Lightroom with the original captures showing. That's a lot of captures to work through for one image, but I know I shot it as a multi-row panorama by manually moving the drone camera around the scene, and that I used DJI's auto exposure bracket to capture 5 light to dark exposures by varying the shutter speed. If I make the filter bar visible by hitting the / key, I can start to drill down and see what I've got. I'll set one of these columns to show shutter speed, and now I can see that there are 5 exposures in each bracket going from 1/50th of a second to 1/320th of a second. I can show you one of the frames here with the 5 different shutter speeds. I do this auto bracket because it's too difficult to capture the bright detail around the sun and also the detail in the shadow areas with just one exposure. So now on to stitching. Lightroom does have the capability to merge all of these exposures into a high dynamic range panorama. However, for some reason, I find Lightroom does not always recognize bracketed exposures shot on the drone. So my approach will be to make a panorama from the lightest exposure and another from the darkest exposure, and then to combine these in Photoshop. I can see that I've actually shot the grid of images twice, as the light was changing fast and you can never be sure when exactly the best moment will happen. If I isolate the lightest exposure, 1/50th of a second, I can show you one set, and then the other set which was shot a few seconds later. I'll stitch both of these together in Lightroom separately, and then we'll compare the two panoramas that were shot a few seconds apart. I've sped up through the panorama process as it's best covered in depth in other videos, and now have the two panoramas that were shot a minute or two apart from the same camera position. I have used fill edges to fill in the gaps around the stitched images, and this has produced some flaws that I'll either have to crop out or fix in Photoshop later. So comparing these two images, I can see that the figure in the image looks better in the second image, and also the clouds look more interesting. So it's the second image that I'm going to work on. So now I merge to panorama the darker bracket of exposures, and here we have the dark and light panoramas. So the reason I do this is that the darker capture will have better detail in the highlights, but the shadows will be less detailed and be more grainy, whereas the lighter capture will have more detail in the shadows and less grain, but the highlight areas will have less detail and be a bit more burnt out. So now to combine these two exposures in Photoshop. Although the exposure of these layers are different, one at 1/50th and one at 1/320th of a second, they look similar because I've processed them in Lightroom first to try and match them as much as possible. But if we zoom in on the figure and switch the top layer on and off, you can see that one layer, which is the layer with the higher shutter speed, has more grain. Also, if we look in a dark shadow area, there's more shadow detail in one of the layers. The last thing to illustrate is that the sun area in one of the exposures has more detail and definition. So the idea of doing this layering is to combine the best parts of each exposure into one composite, with better highlight detail and minimal noise in the shadows. I've also done a bit of custom masking to hide where the layers don't actually line up perfectly, because Lightroom processed each panorama slightly differently. I've also added a layer on top that retouches the areas that were filled in unconvincingly by Lightroom, over here on the left, and then in the clouds on the right hand side. So over the 21-day challenge, I noticed the following points. First of all, don't be put off by marginal weather conditions. It's often in the conditions such as fog and mist and clouds changing rapidly and sun coming through that you get the most photogenic or interesting shots. You never know until you try, really. You just have to go and see what it's like. You may well come away with nothing. That's what worked for me over the 3 weeks. That's when I got my most successful shots, but it didn't always work out. Bit of a fizzer this morning. I'll let this time lapse run for a bit longer, but I'll pack up and go home. The way I like to deal with it too is to be quite prepared. So when the weather was bad, I made sure I did have plenty of warm clothing, gloves, decent hat, because when it's cold and when your nose is running and your hands are freezing, it can be hard to think calmly about the photographic composition and what to shoot next and all the settings. So being prepared for that is well worthwhile to get those shots. Another thing of note is I'm always prioritizing shots, because for one, if I'm shooting here, and I can't be also shooting over there, except in a time-lapse situation, because I have a camera running automatically doing time-lapse. So I'm prioritizing what I think is going to be the most successful shot and spending my time on that. And also constantly weighing up, well, do I wait here for the light to change to get better, or do I move on and try for something different? And the other thing about decisions is because I'm running multiple cameras and also shooting video and recording sound, I can't be doing everything at once. So I need to prioritize what's most important. I also find that return visits are often the most productive. You get to know where the best locations are. You get a chance to fix up your mistakes from previous days. In the end, I photographed predominantly in 3 different locations for this 21-day challenge, and they all had their own advantages and disadvantages. So another thing I noticed over the 21-day challenge was it's better just to get started on something and let it evolve as you go, rather than overthinking and over-planning, which can lead to a bit of paralysis. Over-planning doesn't allow for contingencies and unexpected things which always happen. So if you just get started and allow yourself a bit of time to correct course as you need. The thing is, there's a bit of power in that momentum of getting going and getting some shots under your belt. It really gives you a sense of purpose and momentum. So I find that really worked well for me. Another thing is to be flexible. My best shot turned out to be not of the subject I thought I'd get my best shot from, but I'm open to opportunities as they occur when I'm going through the process. And that was well worthwhile. I would never have anticipated that particular angle. It was just the way the light hit the rocky outcrop and the position I was in, and being able to put myself in the shot. So being flexible and open to opportunities, I think is a really worthwhile thing to keep in mind. So the last point, if I haven't laboured it enough already, is deadlines. So I think the deadline has worked really well for me. It's really kept me focused and made me prioritise getting out there and shooting when the conditions are good. And I'm really happy with what I got. The deadline does get me past that twin hindrance of procrastination and perfectionism. So I think that has worked really well. Just get out there and do it. So on to the next challenge. So here are my 5 favourite images from the 21-day challenge, starting with what I think is the best one and progressing down. I'd be really interested to know which one you think is the best from the 21-day challenge. So let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching. See you next time.